So please do feel free to interrupt and chip in as we go along and stuff. Catherine and I will introduce ourselves and then just talk briefly a bit about why we've developed this way of working down here in Devon and the kind of key ideas behind this approach. And then what we'll do is we'll talk about the targeted version of this relational stuff in terms of relational support plans. And you may well have really great plans in place in your school, or you may feel like some of the plans that you've got around some super vulnerable children don't always seem to help in the moment, or sometimes adults are left a little bit confused about what you mean. We've found here in a number of our Devon schools, adopting these relational support plans has really helped staff kind of understand their role and the power of the relationship and the relational experience they provide for these vulnerable kids. So it's freely available materials and all of that sort of stuff. So we hope that there's something useful for you there. So yeah, good afternoon. I'm Matt, and I was a primary school teacher for a really long time and a Senko for a good few years. And for about the last 12 years, I've been an advisory teacher with a social and emotional mental health team here in Devon. And I support primary, secondary, special school and pupil referral unit settings to try and support children at risk of exclusion. And for the last, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, I've been doing work for the virtual school team. And a couple of years ago, alongside Catherine, we started to develop some relational practice and policy materials to support kind of wider school culture when it comes to supporting children who struggle in this area.
So I'm Catherine, I'm an educational psychologist. I'm really lucky because I've got some time in which I work for the virtual school team. So I spend quite a lot of time working with children in care, but also children on CP plans and children in need. And a lot of this work actually grew out of our work with the virtual school team, working really to support the inclusion of those children who are often our most vulnerable children in schools.
So Catherine, your background was as a secondary school teacher.
That's right, yeah.
And the only reason I say that is because we're likely to have both primary and secondary colleagues here. And what we've put together, that I promise we'll get to in a second, what we've put together in terms of supporting schools to think about relational learning, relational practice, relational ways of working, has been written both for primary and secondary schools in mind. And I know Jonathan described it this way, which we thought was really good, actually, that it's not, what Catherine and I have done is not really created something brand new in any sense. What we've done is pulled together what we perceive to be really helpful stuff for thinking about the role relationship can play in school life and the structures and frameworks and systems that can support that, both for our most vulnerable children and for all children, and sneakily, finally on that, also for us as adults in school. What do we need in order to feel kind of, I don't know, safe and connected and a part of our school life? So I think I might move to a bit of screen sharing stuff, yeah, Catherine. Yeah. Does that make sense? What we have already said, if you've just joined, is there's just a small, here we go. There's a small group of us here. I'll just check Catherine's screen to make sure that that looks right. Yeah, there's a small group of us here. So although we do have a chat box, if your preferred mechanism for asking questions or commenting is in the chat box, please go ahead. But simultaneously, with a smaller group like this, if you just wish to ask something or say something, you can just unmute your mic, camera sort of stuff. Feel free to, you won't be interrupting. Feel free to contribute. So we're just going to talk briefly about the background to the approach and understand one of the main areas that informs why we think it's really helpful for schools to be really considering the role relationships play in development, and not just behavioury sort of stuff, but also learning and how we look after each other and all of our children. Our work's been informed by lots of research, of course, including attachment, including trauma, including adverse childhood experiences. But we are going to just spend a little while talking about neuroception, a branch of the work by a neuroscientist called Stephen Porges, because we think this is a really helpful in informing why it makes sense for us to be focused on relationships, both in terms of our universal way of kind of operating within school, but also our targeted version of this, which is the relational support plan. I've already alluded to the fact that Catherine and I have put together a document which I'm going to put a link in the chat because, or in a little while, I'll put a link in the chat because I was going to do that earlier on, but then Hugh got in and did that brilliantly. Maybe Jonathan will. We'll see what happens. Yeah, nice. All of the materials are freely available and downloadable from the kind of the Babcock Devon website sort of thing, and everything is there for you to be able to take away. And for those that are interested in this PowerPoint, because they might want to share it with some colleagues in school, Jonathan can send this around to interested parties later on. We wrote a guidance document for relational policy, first of all, or we started to work on a document to describe the type of policy that would be more in line with what research and evidence was telling us in terms of what children, particularly our most vulnerable children, need in terms of like feeling looked after in school. About halfway through beginning to write the policy, we realised it would be helpful to describe the practice in some depth and that the policy would just refer to that practice. So there is a kind of relatively extensive guidance document. Thank you, Jonathan. And you can click the link in the chat in order to go and download that. There is another document that we're going to talk about in a little while about the relational support plan, but we'll leave that for a few moments. We're just going to talk really briefly in terms of why we might need to really think about the policies and the practice that they describe in schools.
Okay, so I think it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time about thinking about why we are actually talking about this in the first place and why we think it's really important that we all sort of make a little bit of a shift really towards more relational ways of working. So one of the things that has happened in the last sort of 10 years, I think, so very, very, very recent, is that our understanding of behaviour has really changed, and that's happened because of a lot of the very recent sort of neuroimaging techniques that have been used in neuroscience. And because of that, we now have a much better understanding of the way that our brains work and how our brains cause different physiological shifts for us and how our behaviours then emerge from those physiological shifts. And what, as a psychologist, what I think is really wonderful about all this stuff is that it has completely dovetailed with a lot of some of our really well-established psychological theories around things like attachment and trauma and the impact of that on the developing child. So we've now got a much better understanding of what is happening for some of our young people, particularly those young people who've experienced developmental trauma or have had lots of adverse childhood experiences, which has led to interruptions in their attachment or both significant trauma. So we've now got a much better understanding of what's going on for those children, but also how we are all affected really by the relationships that we form. So, the brain, we realise now, develops through relationships, and therefore our relational experiences will impact on how our brains work, and how our brains work in any particular situation will be different according to our relational experiences. And how, if we're really going to understand why children are the way they are, why they feel the way they do, why different behaviours emerge from those feelings, we've really got to have a good understanding of this, how our brains are working in the moment and how our brains are affected by our relational experiences throughout our development. So one of the things I think that is really obvious is that actually the way that we manage behaviour in school and the way that we support students with emotional needs hasn't really changed for maybe 100 years. We're still working on the same underlying principles. I mean, things have changed because obviously children don't get, there's no corporal punishment anymore, but we are still using very much punitive behaviourist rewards and sanctions to try to shift children's behaviour. And what we really need to do really is, and Matt and I went to a conference not that long ago by somebody called Louise Bomber, who talks a lot about this sort of area, and she talked about how we've all now got an ethical responsibility really to shift what we're doing in line with what we know is the sort of really recent research. And what is really hopeful, I think, about all this recent neuroscience is that it's really changed our understanding of what we can do to make a difference. And that's what's really important about this. So we are going to talk in a little bit about neuroscience. And the reason that we're doing it is so that we can understand what to do. Because whereas people used to think that things were very fixed, what we now know through all that recent sort of neuroimaging is that the brain has got huge plasticity. So the brain goes on changing, goes on developing throughout life. So what we do with a child, the relationships that we form, has the capacity to make a really big difference for those children. So the other reason I think to look at this is because when we analyse our sort of behaviour management practice and systems, it's very clear. And the the Timson review of exclusions was very, very, very clear on this. And there's also been some fantastic research done in Scotland that the most effective behavioural management systems are actually relational and not really behaviourist in their underpinning sort of theories and beliefs and values. So we're not just looking at all that neuroscience and psychology, we're also looking at what works on the ground, and we're looking at what is essentially evidence-based practice. I think the other thing, and this is the thing that has been quite important for us in Devon, it might be less important for you in Harrow, but we really are working really hard to try to shift schools' practice around exclusion. Because what we know is that exclusion has got very negative short and long-term implications for children. And there's a huge link between school exclusion and mental health difficulties, difficulties reintegrating into school, difficulties with employment, low attainment, and a link between school exclusion and the criminal justice system. And really, we work with schools where they reach a point with children and they say to us, we're going to have to exclude them because we can't meet their needs, and this is the only way they're going to get their needs met. And what we know is that sometimes people say that and they really believe that that is going to happen, and what we know is that it rarely happens, and that exclusion from school is never really in the best interest of the child. That doesn't mean to say that children have to go on in the same school forever if that school doesn't meet their needs, but we need to think about how we move children onto a more specialist provision or an alternative provision or something that will suit them better without the need to exclude.
So when Melina introduced this session today, she kind of set the scene in terms of like recognizing how hard it is in school at the moment, and the challenges that life is bringing to us as adults in school. And Catherine and I are often not worried, but would be concerned if people thought, I'm just going to pop along to that thing. Oh no, more stuff to do and stuff. I think one of the things that we feel quite strongly about in terms of developing a relational approach, well, one of the things that we feel really strongly about is for the vast majority of us working in schools, this is how we wish to be. And when working well, this is how we see ourselves. I think that in terms of learning how to be teachers and some of the messages that we received when we were newly qualified or an early career teacher, some of what we heard in terms of behaviour management was slightly counter to what we know is going to be effective for our most vulnerable children, and indeed all children. And one of the things that we think it's helpful to consider is that working in a way that is about investing in relationships, and although that is about digging deep and I don't know, finding time sometimes to connect with kids, we do know that the research is telling us is that investing time in this sort of stuff not only benefits some of the things that we're thinking about today in terms of behaviour and inclusion, but it also has significant knock-on impact in terms of children's learning, children's wish to show up, children's wish to, I don't know, be a part of their school community. So the research is really interesting in terms of working in this way has further knock-ons than children just behaving better in school. But also some research is telling us really clearly that working in this sort of way is really beneficial to the well-being of the teachers, to the adults in school. So it can be really hard to find time. It can be really hard to kind of think about adapting some of what we do, or even just kind of like really trying to spend some time recognizing our strengths in this area. But when it comes to working in a relational sort of way, the more that we can keep this sort of stuff in the forefront of our mind, the more that we can kind of be calling on these type of strategies, the more likely we are to not only have more inclusive environments for our most vulnerable kids, but schools that feel like children are engaged and doing well and making progress, and adults feel good and they're well and looked after by their school setting. One more thing I want to say about it, Catherine. I sometimes think when we're talking about this stuff, it sounds kind of obvious. I guess one of the things that we know about lots of behavior management systems is if we went to school ourselves, went to primary school, secondary school, then university to learn to be a teacher, and then became a teacher, we are almost like conditioned into this kind of, we manage behavior through some type of, at times, polite coercion called rewards, or sometimes through kind of threat, etc. And nobody will be in this meeting thinking, oh, I'm looking forward to this new relational practice. I hope it's got some different ways of threatening kids. We know that that's not what we're doing here. Or if you are here, you might be in the wrong meeting. We know that that's not what we're doing here. But simultaneously, what we know is lots of behaviorism is just so present in school, it's almost invisible. And some of what we're seeking to do with our relational approach is make visible something else.
Yeah.
So this is our model. Make visible something else.
Good.
Does that sound pretentious enough?
It's good. I've never heard you say that before. It's good.
Excellent, wonderful. I'm glad this is being recorded. The one useful thing. I just really want to briefly set the context of this relational support plans, which is the targeted version of this relational way of working. I just want to set it in the context of a wider model. So for Harrow, what you guys are thinking about, or what Jonathan and Melanie are thinking about, is piloting this targeted version of this, which is the relational support plan. And we will get there in a moment, I promise. What we just wanted to briefly introduce you to is that the relational support plan is a targeted version of something that sits within this wider model. And so there is a wider universal relational approach. And there's three parts: about the development of relationships, about how we kind of manage things in the moment, how we respond in a way that is more likely to de-escalate and to calm, and how we repair and restore relationships when things go wrong. Now, there are little arrows around the outside that show how everything feeds into each other, but the central idea is a framework for relational practice that involves developing, responding in the moment, and repairing in the aftermath. Now, each of those three areas have a targeted version for those children that need it most. So a universal version and a targeted version for those that need it most. The relational support plan for how we develop, the responsive co-regulation plan for how we respond in the moment, and then a kind of restorative exploration tool or mechanism for how we support reparation in the aftermath. The materials that Jonathan has helpfully put a link in the chat to explain these in more detail. What we're going to be doing today is thinking about what this looks like in practice. You might even find it helpful to bring to mind a young person who you know struggles with the relational demands of school. Maybe they avoid stuff. Maybe they're quite isolated themselves. Maybe they're someone who's super clingy and then very rejecting. Maybe they're someone who really struggles to regulate. We're going to talk a bit about the background to this way of working, and then we'll go through a relational support plan. And it might be helpful for you to think about a child. We'll call upon a couple of kids that we've been working with recently to think about that relational support plan. Should we think about the why relationships need to be at the heart of what we do, Catherine, and how this informs the relational support plan?
Yeah. So we're going to move into thinking a little bit about sort of a little bit of brain science now, with the purpose of helping us to understand behaviour a little bit better. So one of the things that we all understand is that, you know, behaviour isn't something that is separate to our physiology or our emotional sort of state. So we can't just think about behaviour or try to manage behaviour or change behaviour by just thinking about behaviour. That's where we often go wrong, I think, in drawing on more sort of behaviourist principles. What we know is that our behaviour emerges from how we feel emotionally, and how we feel emotionally emerges from physiological shifts that are going on, you know, within our body. So that our behaviour is just a manifestation, really, of our physiology and our emotional processes. So what happens in any situation is, you know, our brains take in information, our brains react to that information by switching our physiological state, and how we feel physically dictates how we feel emotionally, and behaviour emerges from that. So, and everybody's brains will react differently in different situations. And the reason for that is that the brain develops through relationship, and therefore our development, particularly our relational experiences, will affect how our brains develops, and therefore affect how our brains react in particular situations. So it's really interesting to think about that, to think about how relationships affect brain development, how brains react in certain situations, and what we can do in terms of what we can provide relationally to support that child, both in the moment but also longer term, you know, in terms of their development. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a model of brain development, which comes from Stephen Porges' wider body of work called the polyvagal theory. If anybody's interested in looking more into that, and it's probably something that lots of you are already aware of. We're just going to look at a little bit of what Stephen Porges talks about, which is called neuroception, which is essentially, you know, how our brains detect whether we are safe or not, and then how they respond to that by shifting our autonomic state. So we're going to look at sort of a simplified model of neuroception, which has just pulls out, I think, the things that are most helpful to think about as people who work with children in schools.
I think, sorry, Catherine, just to really briefly interrupt you. I think that this little section now, when Catherine talks about what's happening within the brain and the implications for us in schools, this is the thing that I wish I knew when I was learning to be a teacher. This is the stuff that I wish I knew on my first day sat in front of my class, when all I had in my head is someone told me to develop a death stare, or as was mentioned in the chat earlier on, don't smile till Christmas. I think there's been a number of things that we've drawn on to pull together this relational approach and to kind of create the idea that relationships might be the most significant thing. But I think this neuroception work that Catherine's just going to talk you through, I think this is what creates the reason why we've got a relational support plan. Because although some of this brain science stuff, for me as a primary school teacher, although some of this brain science stuff feels like interesting and complex and stuff like that, it often left me feeling like, gosh, there's lots of different bits of a brain. If only I knew what to do in the corridor when I'm being told to F off. This, what Catherine is about to talk us through, I think, enables us to understand what this means for me in the classroom as my kids come back in after lunch. So even though it's kind of complex neuroscience, we can think about this in terms of what are the 3 things I should be telling the mealtime assistants at lunchtime. So hopefully what emerges from this will be useful for you. And at the end of this, we're going to pause and have a bit of a discussion, and people can chip in any questions or thoughts.
Yeah. So all the time we are checking out whether we are safe within our environment. So our biggest need is for safety. So our brains are taking in information from our environment and assessing the level of threat or the level of safety in the environment. And the first sort of big headline around this work is that we get our sense of safety from people. So in order to work out whether we are safe or not, we look at people to work out whether we're safe, and we look for definite things. And Porges calls these things safety cues. And so there are different safety cues. We're going to think about 3 of the sort of real big ones. So one of the first safety cues is that we look to people's faces to work out whether we're safe or not. And in order to feel safe, we need to see faces that are warm, friendly, attuning, open, and attuning to our own emotions and facial expressions. So we don't always need to see a face that is really, really smiley, you know, over the top, like, you know, happy, jolly, because sometimes our emotional state might be different from that. So if we were anxious, or if we had a bit of worry on our face, or if we were upset about something, we would need to see that reflected back through the attunement of the other person in their facial expressions. And when we receive facial expressions that are warm, open, friendly, and attuning, we know we're okay and we feel safe. If what we experience is a blank face, or a face that doesn't look friendly and warm, or a face that is misattuning to ours, we start to feel uneasy, and we start to feel a little bit anxious. We might be able to even feel our heart rate going up, but we don't feel okay, because physiologically there are things shifting within our body. So the first safety cue is facial expressions. The second is to do with the sound of the voice. So human voices that replicate the type of voice that we might have heard during our very earliest interaction with our primary caregiver. It's that voice that makes us feel safe. So that is sometimes described as a sing-song voice. It's sometimes called as it's called a storytelling voice. But the frequency, the modulation, the musicality of that interaction is what makes us feel safe. So sudden noises, low frequency noises, voices that are very mechanical and lack that musicality make us feel unsafe. So the third safety cue is to do with movement. So we look for movement that is in attunement with our own movement. So that synchronicity, and we see this if you watch two people talking in a cafe, or watch two people, talking on the news, somebody interviewing somebody else. The way that we mirror each other's body language is really quite remarkable, and we do it all subconsciously. We're not thinking about doing it, but in order to connect and attune with other people, we often synchronize and become in time and rhythm, with their movement. So jerky movements, or movements that are not in synchronicity to our own, or particularly upper body movements that are sudden, make us feel unsafe. So if we pick up safety cues, it's the cortex that picks up the safety cues. But if there is an absence of safety cues, so notice I didn't say if we're in a dangerous situation, or if people are shouting at us, or if people are looking really angry at us, because we don't need to be in a dangerous situation to feel unsafe. There just needs to be an absence of safety cues, or the cortex might not have picked up those safety cues. So if there's an absence of safety cues, then the amygdala fires. So the amygdala sends a message to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that links our neurological systems to our endocrine system. So the hypothalamus triggers the release of stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. A message is then sent through the brainstem. So the brainstem is the part of the brain that is responsible for regulating our survival system. So our heart rate, our breathing rate, our digestive system. So the brainstem triggers something called the sympathetic nervous system. And that triggers what you will all be really familiar with, which is our fight or flight response. Heart rate goes up, breathing rate goes up, increased cortisol, adrenaline, digestive system starts churning. We feel anxious, we feel panicky. Interestingly, Porges calls that pathway mobilization, because we don't always have a need to fight or run, but we do always have a need to move. So it might be just wobbling your leg about, or tapping the table, or tapping a pen, or pacing up and down. But it's impossible really to be still when we're on that pathway, because our body is getting ready to mobilize to try to get us into a situation where we are safe. So if that mobilization doesn't get us into a place where we feel safe, or we detect an even greater level of threat, then our life threat pathway is triggered. So again, it's the amygdala that picks that up. The amygdala sends a message through the brainstem to trigger, this time, something called the dorsal vagal regulation. So this is the polyvagal theory. The dorsal vagal regulation is one part of our sort of vagal system. So on this pathway, something completely different happens. So this time we go into immobilization. So this is our most primitive defense response. We're essentially sort of feigning death, which is what would have happened at a very early evolutionary stage if we thought that we were going to be threatened by a predator. So this time our heart rate and our breathing rate go down. We've got reduced energy production, lower adrenaline and cortisol. People who have been on this pathway experience feeling very weak, not really feeling like they are able to move. Some people shut down and disassociate. Some people faint. Children who've experienced being on this pathway quite a lot can present as being very depressed, very low energy, and have very sort of passive adaptations. So one of the things that we know about neurological pathways is that once they're triggered, they're more likely to be triggered again. And the more they're used, the stronger they become. So there are some people, I think everybody will have experienced being on that danger pathway at some time or other in their life. In fact, that's probably triggered almost on a daily basis. Some people will go through the whole of their lives really and never be on that life threat pathway. But once that life threat pathway has been triggered, it can become the default pathway. And some of the children that we're working with in school have highly sensitized danger and life threat pathways that are very easily triggered. And this might be where they are the vast majority of time, either in this mobilization or this immobilized state.
And people sometimes in school, Catherine, this happens for us a lot, and it certainly happened for me as a teacher, will look at those kids and think, he's gone from 0 to 60 in a second, or there was no trigger, or nothing's happened, and look how they're behaving and stuff. And so that's really interesting. I wasn't a negative teacher. It's not like I was constantly looking out for bad news stories or anything, but being slightly baffled by some responses to some children's responses. This really helps me understand that that for some of these kids, that they're already at 55 on a good day. The amygdala is already like, ready to go. And my response sometimes as a teacher, which isn't me being really cross, isn't me really shouting, isn't me being really threatening, but if, for example, they've seen my face and my face says I'm a bit stressed this Monday morning and I've forgotten that I'm supposed to be doing the assembly, for some children, that's the first thing that they'll spot in my face. And it won't be a well thought through cortex involving decision. The amygdala will have triggered adrenaline and cortisol in the bloodstream.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Catherine, that there doesn't appear to be a great deal of activity at the moment in the cortex, which is also interesting because you guys might be doing this in your schools. Certainly loads of my Devon schools are doing it. Is they're constantly, and it's better than telling kids they're being naughty, don't get me wrong, but they're constantly talking to kids about those kids making the wrong choice. Which is really interesting, consider the lack of activity going on in the bit of the brain that will make rational choices.
So all this, even when we go on to the next pathway where the cortex is involved, all this is happening subconsciously. We're not thinking about this at any point. This is happening. It's happening all the time. I'm doing it now. You'll be doing it now. We're always taking in that information to check out whether we're safe or not and assessing threat in our environment.
And everybody knows this, everybody here, Catherine. So we've got this meeting as a virtual meeting. Let's imagine that we were having this meeting, I don't know, in a secondary school near where your school is, and you are about to walk into the room of that secondary school, of which there's already plenty of people sat at tables, and you are going to make a decision where to sit in that room, not knowing anybody there. You will absolutely be scanning the faces of the people in that room to work out whether or not you should sit at that table, or whether as you approach that table, see a grumpy face by somebody with their arms crossed and make a diversion quickly towards another table. You've not consciously thought, as I walk into this room, I want to spot safety cues based on faces, voices and body language, but you will be paying attention to that, and you are unlikely to join the table with the big booming cross voice. Go on, Catherine.
So if there are safety cues and if the cortex is developed enough to pick up safety cues, then the cortex will inhibit the amygdala. So that's a key thing, really. So the cortex has to have picked up a sense of safety to inhibit the amygdala. So there just needs to be an absence of safety to trigger the amygdala. So the cortex then also sends a message through the brainstem to trigger the ventral vagal regulation. The ventral vagal regulation is really complex. There are lots of different branches. Some of it goes to the heart and the diaphragm and the digestive system. And on this particular pathway, the brainstem will be stimulating a calm and regulated heart rate, breathing rate, and digestive system. So we feel calm, relaxed, and regulated. Another part of the ventral vagal regulation goes to the head, and it essentially controls the parts of the nervous system that are responsible for social engagement. So this, I think, is where this model becomes absolutely fascinating. So when we are safe, all the vagal regulation that controls the muscles in our face are all open and active. So when we're safe, we can use our facial expressions to communicate with other people. We can express emotions through our face, and we can notice what other people's facial expressions are like, and we can react to those facial expressions with our own facial expressions. The ventral vagal regulation also goes to our larynx, which means that we can control our voice, and we can use voice prosody. That's the sort of emotionality of the voice. We can use switches in frequency and modulation to be expressive and really express ourselves through varied intonation. The ventral vagal regulation also goes to the ears, and this is really interesting. So when we feel safe, our eardrum is stretched in such a way to let all frequencies of sound through, so we can really concentrate and focus on the human voice, and we can listen to all the nuances and complexities of the intonation and pick up the prosody and the other subtleties of that communication. You know, such a lot of how we understand what people say is just as much to do with how they say it rather than what they say. When we're safe, we can do that. We can listen and we can pick all that stuff up. When we're not safe, the eardrum changes, and what it does is it becomes adapted to pick up signs of danger. So it lets far more low frequency sounds through. So in practice, what this means that the child who is sitting in the classroom who doesn't feel safe finds it really difficult to focus on the human voice, because what they are hearing is all the low frequency noises of distraction, you know, the projector humming, the bus going past the window, the lawnmower outside, the child behind them who's tapping, you know, they're picking up all these distractions, and it's really, really, really difficult to actually listen. So what happens is, so for children who spend all their time on their safety pathway, they can spontaneously socially engage, and that happens from the minute that they are born. If a child experiences a sense of safety, it's seeking connection by looking at other people's faces, by mirroring facial expressions, by very, very quickly being able to attune facial expressions and movement and sound to the person that they're with. So, and then gradually over time, our experiences of connection and interaction and social engagement get more and more complicated. And the child who's on their safety pathway for the vast majority of time socially engages all the time and gets really, really good at it. They use their faces, they see other people's facial expressions, they respond to that, they use their voices, they listen, they get really good at reading other people, so they can work out what somebody else might be thinking or feeling purely by listening to the voice, by watching the faces, and by noticing people's movement. And they get really, really, really good at picking up safety cues. So that arrow goes in one direction, really it should also go in the other direction, because the more social engagement we have, the more highly developed the cortex gets, and the better it gets at detecting threat in the environment. So children who are safe most of the time have a really healthy neuroception. They can accurately detect whether they are safe or not. And their brain works, and their brain stem works really, really well to regulate their survival systems all the time, and shifts autonomic state between social engagement, mobilization, and immobilization really, really accurately, and in a sort of productively, in a way that is. Children who have spent all their time on their danger or life threat pathways, their social engagement system will have been closed off, so they won't have been able to develop the cortex. So the cortex can't pick up the safety cues, even if the safety cues are there. So they sort of remain on their danger pathway, and children can get locked in a kind of cycle that we really need to break. And that's a lot of what this relational approach is about. It's about thinking about how we break that cycle. So for those children who don't feel safe, so these danger pathways and life threat pathways become really, really, really strong, and they don't experience having that ventral vagal regulation open, and so they can't socially engage very well, and then the cortex doesn't develop, and then they can't pick up the safety cues. We've got to work out how to break that cycle. And what's really interesting is that, we haven't talked about the role of the amygdala. The amygdala is the brain's alarm center, but really interestingly, the amygdala has also got a role to play in our episodic memory, and particularly the episodic memory, which is to do with how we felt at particular times in our life. So for those children who have experienced early trauma, or who have had a real lack of attachment and have got attachment needs, what happens for them is that they can walk into a classroom where they see a teacher who is just maybe a little bit stressed or a little bit tired. Their computer won't work. They might not be looking particularly warm or attentive or open. And for some children, when the amygdala sees, when the brain takes in that information, the amygdala reads that as threat, because those children have seen that face before, and it means something to them, and it triggers that danger pathway or that life threat pathway. For those children who've been on their safety pathway, a lot of the time they've got a highly developed cortex. They can see that teacher's tired face or grumpy face or slightly stressed face, and they know what that means. They've seen those faces before as well, but they think it's just their dad who's a bit tired, or their mum who can't like the barbecue or something. They read that really accurately, and they know what they need to do is probably just be a little bit quiet. But they stay in their cortex, they stay in that safety zone, they stay thinking about that. But for those children whose amygdala has gone, alarm, 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 those danger pathways have been triggered.
What tends to happen when a danger pathway is triggered is, and I don't know, I feel like I'm breaking the fourth wall somehow here, but this isn't just a kid's brain. This is also the teacher's brain. What happened when that danger pathway is initiated, Catherine, is one of the things that we know about that kid is it's likely they've moved into some type of mobilization, which might mean that they've started tapping, knocking their work, bashing the person next to them. And what happens to my brain as the teacher at that moment in time is I seem to then utilize a system that affirms their need for safety, because I move into my teacher voice, and then maybe what I do is threaten some type of sanction, etc., etc. There's what I think about that. The first time I heard Catherine talk about that, it made me think about loads of things. The second time, it made me think about even more things. What we want to do just for a couple of minutes for you is there anything there that stands out for you as important? Is there anything for you there as class teacher, adult in school, member of pastoral team, whatever? Is there any kind of implications for you? And also just kind of reflecting a bit more on your school. Is there anything in terms of your school systems or structures or procedures or agreed responses to inappropriate behaviour that you think this challenges or this affirms? You might think, do you know what? My interactive whiteboard's a pain in the backside, but I always welcome the kids into my class. I have a way of interacting with my kids that says, it's all right, I get you, we know it's okay. You might have found some of this affirming, even though you didn't know it was linked to a whole body of neuroscience research. You might also think, blimey, every time I do an assembly, I look like I've got a right grump on. We're going to give you a couple of minutes just to have a bit of a think about it. If what you would like to do is unmute your camera stroke microphone, then we can have like a little bit of a discussion at this point about where we are. If you don't like doing that, but you want to put a comment in the chat, feel free to do so. We'll take a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back together with any questions or thoughts. We'll just mute us for a moment, Catherine.
Yeah.
Hey, folks, you might have, I don't know, you might be thinking like, blimey, there's too much to think about to even share anything. And that's absolutely fine. You might also think, oh, I'm tired. It's the end of a Monday. I stayed up really late last night watching the final part of Stranger Things. How am I possibly going to contribute to a discussion about neuroception? However, we'll just kind of pause briefly in case there is a question or a thought or a not quite sure before we kind of look at what this means in terms of relational support plans. Okay, good stuff. Interestingly, one of the things that all of that horrendously complex and sometimes very kind of, I don't know, scary research into things like attachment, trauma, adverse childhood experiences. I remember, like, as a Senko, vaguely hearing about any of that stuff, and all it left me to do was to feel completely underskilled. Every time I heard about that level of complexity involved in this sort of stuff, I always felt like I was taking a step back from the kid at those times. Certainly as a Senko, every time I learned more about kind of trauma, I just spent my time making more referrals to outside specialists. And like it kind of made sense I did that, Catherine, because it all sounds scary and I'm only a teacher and what will I know? And then I've got a member of my teaching support pastoral team saying, I'm only a teaching assistant, what can I do, etc., etc. It's really interesting because, of course, what we learn from everything about adverse childhood experiences, the biggest protective factor is relationships. What we learn about attachment is that we can build secure, attached relationships with people that we see every day who interact with us, even briefly. The difference that we can make through relationships. And I don't think anyone here will be surprised that the top right-hand corner of neuroception is about how we interact with each other in school. The bottom left-hand corner of neuroception is something I have complete power over when I feel okay myself, and that's my face and my voice and my body language. Now, I do need to be mindful that when I'm stressed, I'm a bit more likely to do that. But this isn't really about 6-week intervention. This isn't really about a referral to CAMS. This is about us being mindful of our faces, our voices, and our body language, how we enable kids to feel safe through how we interact with them. And this is also about that top right-hand corner here, about how, when they are safe and we are safe, we interact with each other in a way that practices or experiences healthy social interaction, particularly in terms of how we use our voices and how we use our faces. So the learning that Catherine and I draw out of this is about really the importance of relationships. Relationships in enabling children to feel safe. Relationships in relation to how we engage together to create a sense of connection. How we try to understand what's going on for children and use our understanding to help them understand themselves. I think I alluded to this earlier on, or I mentioned this earlier on. I think the language of choice is a kind of questionable idea now, really. In fact, quite recently on a longer course explaining relational stuff, I heard Catherine talking about how there's a group of psychologists believing that we don't really make any kind of rational decisions. We just respond or react in the moment, and then a little bit later on use our hindsight to think, oh, I probably did that because of that. Yes, I probably am a thoughtful species. How we enable kids to feel safe, connected, understood, and how we care for children and how we provide experiences which help create neurological pathways that are really helpful for them and over time develop healthy or more accurate neuroception. Catherine has used the word, I've written it down 4 times, I've written the number 4 next to it. I think a helpful word when I think about this sort of stuff in terms of behaviour is that behaviour emerges from this physiological or change in physiological state. Catherine, you said emerges 4 times. I feel like, yes, you did. I feel like it must be important. We've not got long, and if you use the word 4 times, it feels like it must be. So Catherine and I take this stuff And we make sense of it in terms of relational support, which invites us to consider how we provide these experiences that enable kids to feel safe and connected and understood or cared for. We talk about them in terms of protection, connection, understanding, and care. Bullet point number 2 is my favorite pretentious point of all of this work, which is that most of what we consider in terms of relational support is about a way of being together, more so, certainly as much as what we're doing. And I think we all know that. We all see some members of staff in schools who have got absolutely amazing resources with a kid. They've opened the most brand new plasticine, but the interaction that's taking place just feels like an adult's mildly frustrated about working with a kid who doesn't really engage appropriately. And sometimes we see an adult out on the playground with a kid with a battered up old tennis ball, but what's happening between them, Catherine, is beautiful. They're the only people in the world. It's totally connecting and meaningful. So relational work is about a way of being. And just finally, where we're heading with this work and what Harrow are, I think, excitingly inviting schools to think about piloting with support and with ongoing development opportunities, thinking about how for our most vulnerable children, we attempt to, I don't know, articulate relational support in a useful framework, a relational support plan. So what we're going to do for the next little while is talk about relational support and what we mean by that in practice, a targeted version of this stuff. And then we'll look at how it can be useful to capture or formulate that in terms of a relational support plan. For Catherine and I, the cornerstones of our relationship, Melena's just a bit of information for schools there. Thanks, Melena. In terms of how we consider relational practice or relational support and practice or relational learning or a way of being in relationship, we think about these 4 areas as the cornerstone of the relationship. And what Catherine and I have done here is we've not attempted to dissect relationships to death so that all of the magic is gone. But what we've tried to do is support us in understanding what we mean by, I don't know, secure relationships. And I'll stop talking in a second, Catherine. When I was a Senko, I interviewed people, and people used to come to see me to be part of the pastoral team. And often I would say, you'll be working with Albert this afternoon. And what I would do is they would say, I don't really know Albert yet. And I would say, no, you're new here. Just for the first couple of weeks, just build a relationship with Albert. And they would say, oh, that's really helpful, thank you. And they'd leave my little Senko room full of files on the wall where I pretended I knew what I was doing. And they would leave that Senko room and say, I know what I've got to do. I've just got to work on building a relationship with Albert. And I probably did that, Catherine, for 20, 25 people over the 3 or 4 years I was a Senko. And I think each of them left that room with a different understanding of what I meant by build that relationship. And if I'm being perfectly honest, and I'm glad we're not recording this, Jonathan, I don't think I knew what I meant when I said build that relationship. So some people left thinking, just have a nice time with him. Some people left thinking, just have a nice time, only do what he wants. Some people left that meeting thinking, don't say no to him. That won't help the relationship. And other people left, understandably, thinking, yeah, build a relationship. I know what you mean. Going hard. Tough love. Emphasis on the tough. And what I realise now, and what I've done in this privileged role of working with Catherine, is try to articulate what we might mean by work on building, maintaining, and at times repairing that relationship through offering high levels of protection, connection, understanding, and care. These become, if you like, the cornerstones, the kind of main framework of a relational support plan. A plan that comes with some prompting questions, a simple process to follow to be able to put together effective plans, a document to support you in doing that, etc., etc. This is something that Jonathan and Melena think is a good enough idea that they're thinking, why don't we see if some schools wish to pilot this sort of work? And there's materials to support you. There's a process to support you, and there's a kind of framework with useful prompting questions so that we can think about individual children and consider what might protection, connection, understanding and care look like for that child. So what we're going to do now is just briefly kind of have a little bit of an insight in terms of what we mean by protection, connection, understanding and care. And what we thought we'd do, just briefly again, is for each of those areas, just talk a bit about a kid that we've been working with recently, where a school thought, what does this need to look like in terms of a relational support plan then? Protection. And should I reiterate that people can interrupt or put things in the chat and that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Protection is about providing and being a source of safety through the relationship and the interactions that you have, particularly, and it's probably going to be the last time I say it, being mindful of how we use and are aware of our faces, particularly when children are coming into our classrooms, how we use our voices, particularly when we are needing to let kids know that they might be drifting off task, how we utilize our body language in a way that lets kids know that we're together with them in synchronicity and in rhythm, not in a way that's seeking to threaten them. It is also worth saying that this work is absolutely about having firm, caring boundaries, about having assertive, nurturing ways of being together. This approach is not permissive and soft and chaotic, but when supporting children to understand the boundaries, we do so in a way that is feels like we're really looking after them, not threatening them. So it is helpful to think about how our routines and our structures and the rhythm of the school day is supportive for children feeling safe. Chaos is not containing. However, the vast majority of plans that exist around children talk about stuff to do. What we really want to highlight for staff when working through a relational approach is how we are being with the children is the greatest sense of safety. When kids feel unsafe, they don't look for card systems, they don't look for get out clauses, they look at us to try and work out if they are safe. Behaviour management responses really need to be thought about in terms of enabling kids to feel safe, because sometimes a teacher in a secondary school pushing a button under their desk that sends a senior leader legging it down a corridor, you can hear the clip-clop of the shoes in the distance, and you can simultaneously hear heart rates and breathing rates go up in a classroom. We need to be really mindful about how we respond when things are beginning to escalate in a way that feels clear, but also is about projecting a sense of safety. The final thing to say on this, Catherine, before we give a bit of an example, I guess, is change, transition, any type of challenge, something different emerging. We're getting towards the end of term, and so our timetable looks different, etc. Children who do not automatically feel safe find this stuff hard. I often think about transitions if that's the end of one activity before another activity. For children who struggle with this sort of stuff, transitions are often the end of one relationship, a bell's gone, and now I need to form another relationship. Endings and beginnings.
So a little example around a relational support plan that Matt and I worked on with a school with a very vulnerable young man in a secondary school who was really hurtling towards sort of permanent exclusion. So there was a few sort of interesting things thrown up around protection for him. So I think one is that when I met him prior to putting together this the relational support plan, one of the things that he said to me, and it's not the first time a child has said this, in fact many children have said it, he said that one of the things that he found really difficult in school was that people kept shouting at him, and actually nobody was shouting at him, but his neuroception was that when he heard certain ways of speaking, you know, his heart rate would go up, his breathing rate would go up, and therefore he described that really as being shouted at. But so nobody was shouting, but what was happening was people were probably speaking to him in a bit of a harsh way. They were removing that sort of storytelling type of voice. I mean, one of the things that he said to me is I want people to talk to me with respect, he said. So, for example, if I drop a piece of paper on the floor, I want people to say, can you pick that piece of paper up? Not, pick that piece of paper up. Now, actually, I don't think anybody was speaking to him like that, but he had such a, he had an incredible background. He'd had a, never had safety, had he that boy, and his neuroception was not accurate, and he picked up threat very easily. So any sign of harshness, rejection, aggression would trigger this huge reaction. So one of the things that was on his relational support plan around protection was for people to be very mindful about how they sounded and how they looked, and to think really carefully about how they could be with him and be firm, but whilst also being very safe in terms of their interaction. There are a few other things as well, I think, which is to do with that consistency and predictability. So there was one teacher who was absolutely brilliant with this boy, and he was observed working with him, and there was so much came out of that observation in terms of what would be helpful for other pupils. So one thing was that there was a real consistency in the way every lesson started. So he would often give him a little job to do at the start, which was often giving out the books. So that boy's first experience of coming into the lesson was always a little bit of safety from the teacher, and then a job that was actually quite regulating for him, but there was a reliability around that was really helpful for him, because transitions were really difficult. So the start of a lesson, where it often feels a little bit chaotic, a little bit of that, he always knew what he was going to do, and that really helped him sort of with that transition. And also there was a lot of thought about where he sat, because in that lesson he would sit near the front but kind of offside, so that he wasn't always looking behind him all the time, because most danger comes behind, and a lot of our children who don't feel safe are very hyper-vigilant to that. But Jay could sit sort of towards the front but with his back to a wall, so he kind of felt safe.
Protection, connection.
Yeah. So connection is very much about providing a lot of opportunities for the top right-hand corner of that neuroception diagram. So this is all about maximising social engagement to enable children's cortex to develop and to experience connection with others, through which they start to understand themselves and other people and how to be in relationship with other groups, but also with the whole of society, really. And it's through connection that we develop our understanding of this. So connection is to do with opportunities to use your face and your voice and your movement, and to watch other people's faces and voices and movement. And for some children, it really will be about enabling them to practice very, very, very early connection. So really sort of expressive interaction. And one of our first experiences of connection is actually having somebody with us mirroring what we do, so doing things in time and rhythm, and then moving on to being able to take, to start to notice what other people are doing, notice that people respond to you, notice that you influence other people, allowing other people to influence you, allowing other people to take a lead, being curious in other people. And that is often developed through very play-based activities. And we need to play not just in nursery or key stage 1 or key stage 2, but all the way through our lives. We engage in activities together that is essentially sort of different forms of play, where we're with other people. We've got a joint vision, we're sharing emotions, we're responding to each other, we're listening to each other, we're teaching each other, we're learning from each other. And gradually throughout life, our interaction becomes more and more complex, and it's providing children with increasingly complex opportunities for social engagement and connection that's going to help them understand their sort of place within relationships, and help them to understand other people and rights and rules and responsibilities, and develop their sort of ethical and moral code. And a lot of this stuff should be playful, and it should be fun, and children often get this connection from stuff that we consider to be sort of extracurricular stuff, like, I don't know, art club or drama club or music club or sports, and all those things are vitally important and seem to be being pushed out of the curriculum, but we really need to try to hold on to them. But also we need to find a way of building connection into our everyday interaction with children. You know, when we're teaching maths or English or history or whatever, how do we connect with children through our everyday teaching and our everyday interactions, to know that they're, you know, connected to the adults in school, but also beyond that, connected to their peers, connected to the curriculum, and that they have a sense of belonging in school, you know, that school belongs to them, that they can make a contribution to school, and that it is very much, you know, well, I think belonging is the best word for that, isn't it? It's their school.
So with that in mind, in terms of a relational support plan, and a quick reminder that there's prompting questions for each of those 4 aspects: protection, connection, understanding and care. But I was involved, I don't know, a couple of months ago, I'd say, with a little boy in year 2 who's at a primary school in Devon, and he's a child in care, and you didn't need to observe him for more than a couple of minutes to realise he didn't feel very connected to things. He flitted around the classroom, really unsure about how to join in with things, really looked a bit invisible, I felt. And the teaching assistant, who was obviously a really nice person, you know, working in a school, obviously a nice person, she said, "Are you sticking around for some of his special time?" And I thought, oh, fantastic. Yeah, but I'd love the idea of him receiving some special time that feels really meaningful and connecting. I can't wait to see that. And so she said, "I'm doing that in a minute." And so I kind of followed him a couple of minutes later outside, and she sat at a table with him, and she did have really nice Play-Doh. It was like it was still in like its different coloured pots, you know, and then he played with the Play-Doh a bit, and she started like, well, it wasn't connecting, but she started being nice, saying things like, "Oh, that's nice. What are you making there?" And then he made the most disastrous decision you could make and began mixing some of the Play-Doh colours. And I do understand it, you know, I'm not really meaning to slag her off, but like, so then her voice changed a little bit, and she said, "Do not mix it. We've talked about it." Just becomes like that sort of stuff. And so what we did as part of his relational support plan is talked about how what he needs is an experience of connection. And even when she's at her best saying nice things about him, there is not a connecting togetherness to it. So that 5th bullet point is about being together in time and rhythm. And so as part of his plan, whether or not it was Lego or plasticine or painting or playing with a ball, it was about finding opportunities to be together in time and rhythm. And so this teaching assistant said, "Oh, I get it. So we could build a tower together with Lego or something." And I kind of invited her, as part of using the relational support plan, to consider where he is in terms of his development, in terms of connection. And so what they actually started working on really was just her moving in rhythm with him, with her bit of plasticine, her bit of Play-Doh, before they began over time working on making something together. He needed to experience connection to know that he was not alone. Protection, connection, understanding and care. We're just going to talk really briefly about understanding. And I think that this is an area that we all do get. It's just sometimes hard in the moment when we're tired ourselves to call upon this level of empathy and compassion. So when observing behaviour, understanding is about being curious about what that might mean and what that might be telling us. And I don't mean telling us like this kid has a diagnosable attachment disorder. I mean, I wonder what that behaviour tells me in terms of how they're feeling. And I wonder then how I might respond to that using my relationship in a way that might help the child understand themselves. So at this stage, we think about regulation. We think about providing children with attunement and validation and containment to enable the child to see themselves reflected back in the adult, to understand that what they might be feeling is okay to feel that. So for some children, when it comes to understanding, they might need a planned approach to how we agree to respond at different stages of regulation or dysregulation. So alongside a relational support plan, there is a co-regulation plan, which some adults working with some children might benefit from. So it's for the benefit of the child, but really it's to support adults to provide a consistent, predictable, reliable approach. At different stages of regulation, children might need different responses from adults. We can talk about that with Gary in a moment. The final thing to say about understanding is being able to share our understanding with a wider group of people in school. Different adults will have their different kind of triggers and their different lines, but the more that there is an understanding that for this child, point number 5, their behavior emerges, Catherine, it's a new word for you, emerges from what's going on for them physiologically, the more that that plan is shared, the more likely we are to kind of provide a consistent, reliable response. So Gary was a young man in a primary school with a significant amount of trauma in his life, and I think the first thing that happened is adults realized that in terms of their understanding, I think what they realized is their panicked response to Gary, and it was hard not to panic around Gary because he was quite unpredictable and he was very efficient at taking his clothes off quickly and running through the school. So adults would be panicked by Gary. And so what adults began to realize is containing their own emotion, trying hard to understand what was happening for them in terms of how they could best help Gary was really important. And they realized that being a bit more preventative and a bit more regulated themselves was helpful. The understanding work that was a part of the plan that they did with Gary was supporting Gary to kind of understand his level of regulation, where he could point to parts of his body on a scale. When he was calm, he was down in his feet. When he was a little bit unsure, he was moving up towards his tummy. And when he needed out, he was up at his head. And sometimes his teaching assistant used to take him out of the classroom to say, I can see you're struggling a little bit. How about we do something a bit different for a moment? And there was a particular day where we thought we've probably cracked this, where Gary turned to her after being taken out of class and said, what are you doing? I've been in my ankles all morning. Which is a lovely bit of like a regulatory awareness from Gary. The final thing they did as part of the plan is they developed on their lanyardy things, those infamous lanyardy things, just a simple little card system. And one of the cards that they sometimes had on their lanyard said, it might look like it's all over the shop, but the last thing we need now is another adult helping. And so one of the things that they had as part of the co-regulation plan is if you see this little card on my lanyard, it means we are okay. Try not to come in to dysregulate the situation further. The person who found that hardest was the head teacher, who definitely wanted to be supportive, but often would escalate the situation by coming in, asking questions, using too much language. Catherine, look, we're on to the final bit of the relational support plan.
Okay, so care is really about meeting a child's needs for attachment. So sometimes this is about looking after their really basic needs so that they know that they can trust and depend on somebody to meet those basic needs. So it might be about giving a child breakfast if they need it. It might be about giving them a warm coat to go out and play in. But of course, when you meet a child's basic needs in that way, you're not just doing that, you're showing them that you care about them. You are showing them that they are worthy of your time, of your attention, of your love, and therefore that they are likable and lovable and effective and have a sense of agency because they can do things and other people will respond and look after them and care for them. So I think a sort of a good example of this is, a girl that we worked with, a secondary school girl, a while ago now, who was really struggling with school. Child in care, often sent out of lessons to their reset room, often excluded from school, was then started to school refused because school was not a welcoming place for her. So we worked with her just before the first lockdown, didn't we? And then we went into lockdown. And what we were really trying to do at that time was to get her connected to at least one adult in school. And so the girl hadn't really had anything much to do with the person who was going to try to become her significant adult. But this person, Katie she was called, would email the girl really regularly, and the girl would say, why is that person emailing me? I don't want emails from that person, you know, and would never ever respond. And we kept having little meetings about it, and Katie would say, I don't know what to do, I'm sending all these emails, she never responds. And we were saying, well, let's just keep going, let's just keep going. We talked to the foster carer, and the girl would say to her foster carer, what's she talking about now? She's talking about making madeleines. Why is she, you know, why is she telling me that? And her foster carer would say, well, maybe it's because she cares about you, and maybe she's telling you things because she's interested in what in what you're doing. Anyway, this went on for the whole of the lockdown. Katie sent several emails a week. The girl, not once did she respond. The girl started back at school. Katie eventually over time developed a really, really, really good relationship with her. This girl really trusted Katie, would come to see her a lot, definitely became a significant adult. Gradually, the girl also developed some relationships with other people in school. And then towards the end of her time in school, Katie was off school sick. And the girl was working with another of her significant adults, and they had a little bit of time where they could do something that the girl wanted to do. And she said that what she wanted to do that day was to bake. And she chose something to bake, and the other adult didn't know why she was choosing this particular thing. And she made these little cakes, and then at the end of the day, they had a Zoom call with Katie, who was off work, and the girl proudly showed Katie the madeleines that she'd made that day. And it's such a lovely kind of like sort of, not really metaphor, is it, because it's a real thing, but just a lovely example there of how that persistence in care for those children who can have a very avoidant attachment style, you know, that persistence, that caring, that coming back, showing them that they're special, liking them, you know, holding them in your mind, never letting them go, and just that experience over time, how that was so important in terms of their relationship.
Oh, I love that story. But
Nice
she's such a vulnerable young child. I find that story kind of quite emotional. But when I mention that I find it emotional to Catherine, she looks at me like I'm somehow weak. And that's the educational psychologist doing that. Psychologist doing that. Okay, so just finally, just for a couple of minutes, and then we'll kind of throw it open. We hope everyone's still okay on this Monday afternoon. Catherine and I are not obsessed with paperwork, and we want plans to feel like a way of capturing a useful process that helps people think and learn and understand their role in that process. It can be helpful to capture that process in a relational support plan. I mentioned it earlier on. It's a way of trying to formulate some thoughts and some discussion in terms of protection, connection, understanding, and care. In Devon, these relational support plans have gone that. Will you read that really long bit? In Devon, these plans have gone down really well. All children in care have a relational support plan. And for lots of other children, plans can be helpful. But if schools are like, I can't do another plan, what we invite them to do is just consider relational support. Consider protection, connection, understanding, and care. And the document that we've written, which we promise is super accessible, could be read by a Senko designated teacher in like 25 minutes. It helps formulate and think about putting together helpful, accessible relational support plans. It involves working initially with the child so that their voice is very present, inviting them to consider who they think they would like on their team, etc. Inviting them to consider when they and others are at their best. It's about working with a core team, the team that are most likely to be in contact with that child throughout the day, throughout the week. Sometimes, particularly in secondary schools, it can be helpful to have a senior leader on that core team because they ultimately make kind of decisions about responses to behaviour. And then an opportunity to share the plan with a wider team, just really briefly. So although everybody in that main team thinks about protection, connection, understanding, and care, not everybody is doing everything. So at the end of a relational support team meeting, each person has to highlight the 2 or 3 things that are for them. So what they understand is that the relationship is going to be the most significant thing into supporting the child. They understand what they need to do or how they need to be as part of their bit of the relational support plan. And they also have to understand that they are part of a wider team of people who are thinking about and caring for this pupil. As a template, we don't mind what schools use. In Devon, different schools use different things, and some of our schools integrate relational support into the plans they've already got. What we do often say for our schools is that the prompting questions for each section of protection, connection, understanding and care have been written by experts, have been thought about quite significantly in terms of what you will all know, and it's not a trick, is that the relational support plan supports adults to be a particular way with the child, which in turn supports the child. In the link that that Jonathan put in the chat at the start, as well as the main document, there is also this document to support relational support plans, which is part of the wider model and can, should you wish to do it yourself, be downloaded from here. We've got 4 minutes remaining, Catherine. That feels like a good time for us to pause. Maybe even, did you read the comment? Was there anything to say about the comment?
I did.
And then should we open the comment up to the wider group? Any thoughts from people, etc.? Let's see if I can stop sharing. Yeah, I might be able to. Has that worked? Yes, that has worked. People have listened. There's been a lot of blooming here, Catherine. Maybe what people will want to do is, as soon as they finish watching this, Jonathan can send them a link to a recording and then they could just watch it all over again. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that on a Monday evening? Was there anything about that comment, Catherine, that you wish to share or not?
Hugh's comment is just a really helpful comment around the usefulness of the framework. And I think that, you know, there are many people who will be doing a lot of these things already. Absolutely. But I think developing that common language about that, and to, you know, for some of our most vulnerable children, it's not always enough, is it, just to respond instinctively? I think we've got to have a frameworks for working and to you know, think really carefully, be really curious about the way that those what children's behaviour is telling us. So Hugh was just saying, you know, that thinking about needs in that framework, protection, connection, understanding and care, and using that common language could be really helpful.
All right, cool. Catherine and I are really happy to hang on here. People have already come and hoovered quite noisily outside this little office room, so we're really happy to sit here for as long as we like to talk about this relational sort of stuff. But I'm also aware that some people will be like, well, it's 5:28. We must be nearly finished now.
Matt and Catherine, I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank you so much for your input. It's absolutely fascinating. As I was listening to your presentation again, I was thinking about an acronym for those 4 key areas. I think my worst was PUCK. You might not, as long
as we all give a PUCK, we'll be fine. Yeah.
But I think I made this point at our first session, that for schools that are on this, you know, this session, that you are doing so much of this fantastic work already, but it's about putting maybe those 4 key areas of connection, protection, understanding and care, you know, just cover it with what you're doing. And hopefully, you know, we want life for you in your schools, in your settings, to be pleasant and enjoy, you know, bring back the joy of teaching and learning and children engaging and so on. And you're dealing so much with, you know, sadly, some of the behaviours that have come out, particularly from as a result of the pandemic. And, you know, clearly we want our children to feel safe. And yeah, I think this has been a wonderful model. And as I've said, Jonathan and Hugh, we're a little team. We're working together to support schools in making sure that, you know, if they want to pilot it, that it's there, that opportunity is there. Yeah. I don't know if Hugh or Jonathan wants to say any final words, comments before we close the session.
I think it's been really helpfully presented, and I just hope that that it kind of resonates with schools as much as I think it has done for us. And, you know, I think within the sort of context of these sort of ongoing behaviourist sort of approaches in schools, it's refreshing to hear something that sort of fits more with our sort of core beliefs, really, about nurturing and working with children and young people. And I'm just curious how schools, because we haven't been very prescriptive with schools about, you know, where do you take this next? So I'm really interested in, you know, whether it might gain a bit of traction, and whether, you know, it might be something very small scale, like a school just saying, you know, let's use this framework within some existing plans or things that we use, or just using this great relational support plan for a target group of children, and just thinking, you know, for our looked after children, let's just use this for a period of time and structure our meetings around that, and see how that works, and then that may build to something else if other staff find that useful. Or some schools, like I know this morning, were suggesting you know, it's something that they want to do as part of a sort of a wider shift to their you know, emotional mental health practice, or their a sort of policy, if you like, within schools. So who knows where it will go, but I just I think it's been really interesting to sort of fire up some ideas, really.
Thank you, Hugh. I'm just conscious that we've just gone 1 minute over, but yes, thank you. We're so precious about time, I know, when we're in these meetings, but I think what we'll do, we'll end it there. And for our school colleagues, we will be in touch, and we'll take this discussion further. And Matt and Catherine will be in touch, definitely.
Thank you for having
So
us.
thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.